I'll make sure it's working on the back end too.
All right, everybody. This will be fun. We got a nice crowd. Thank you again for doing this.
It's our pleasure. My pleasure, at least.
Me too.
We are live on YouTube, everyone.
Wonderful. All right, let's let folks in. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a second. Kathleen, I'm ready whenever you are.
All right. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Tribal Sovereignty and Efforts in the Maine Legislature. Ensuring that Wabanaki people's inherent sovereignty is recognized by the state of Maine this year is a top priority for many of us, including Maine's Environmental Priorities Coalition. Restoring the Wabanaki tribe's ability to manage tribal lands, waters, and resources makes sovereignty an environmental issue, but at its heart, sovereignty is about fairness, equity, and righting wrongs. We are joined today by Penobscot Nation Ambassador Maulian Dana and Passamaquoddy tribal citizen and attorney Corey Hinton. Next slide. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations work to protect Maine's environment and our democracy through education, collaboration, advocacy, and political action. A few technical notes for today's event. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. Please send your questions to me, Kathleen, through the chat as they occur to you. You can find the chat by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. I will keep track of your questions to ask during the Q&A at the end. If you have any technical difficulties, please message Will Sedlak through the chat function for help. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you for joining us, and Ambassador Dana and Corey, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ambassador, I'm just going to pull up the presentation real quick.
Perfect. Awesome. So I can kick us off here. It's really great to see you all. My name is Maulian Dana. I am the Tribal Ambassador for the Penobscot Nation. I also serve as the President of the Board of Directors for the Wabanaki Alliance. And I'm super excited to be able to share with you some of our efforts going on in this legislative session, the 130th. A lot of it is carrying over from the 129th, when our work, like a lot of people's work, was disrupted by the pandemic. We were able to get some pretty historic votes out of committee when it comes to amending the Land Claim Settlement Act. So we are hopeful going forward, but we know that it's still quite the journey ahead of us. So we're really happy to have as much support around Maine as we can get. Thank you to Corey Hinton for adding his expertise here today. He's a very brilliant legal mind, and it's always really special to me to have a Passamaquoddy citizen leading the charge in the legislature around this from a legal perspective. I think it's really significant and awesome. So the big picture we're going to talk about today is amending the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act through legislation in the Maine legislature because we are looking to create more equity and fairness for the tribes in Maine. Now, the Wabanaki tribes are the Passamaquoddy, which have two communities, one at Medocnigook or Indian Township, one at Sabayak or Pleasant Point. There is the Penobscot Nation, which is kind of centrally located in Maine. And then up in Aroostook County, we have the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians and the Aroostook Band of Mi'kmaq. And while this legislation really only affects the Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Maliseet, we're also really honored and blessed that the Mi'kmaq are adding their voice to this charge of unity that we've really found around this effort. Part of the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act was language added in the 11th hour that has blocked our access to federal beneficial acts that every other tribe in the country is entitled to and enjoys. We are entitled to them, but we haven't had access to them. So a big part of the oppression of the tribes in Maine for the past 40 years since this passed into law has been not being able to really have our inherent sovereignty recognized, but also that relationship with the federal government has been really stifled and at times non-existent. We were able to work through the Violence Against Women Act law through the Maine legislature to expand that jurisdiction to Maine tribes, but it was a really complicated and difficult process. So we are looking to finally amend this on a very large scale, and it truly is all about fairness and equity. So how did we get here? I think Corey can get into this a little bit in more detail on the court cases and such, but I will tell you that the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act has been studied to death. Recommendations have been made time and time again, and it has always fallen flat and fallen short. A lot of the recommendations are pretty much in line with what we've crafted this time. And the process this time was a task force called by the state government that basically comprised of tribal leaders, the tribal chiefs or their designee, and lawmakers as the voting members, and then the Attorney General's office and Governor's office were also included in the meetings as non-voting members. So these 22 recommendations, a lot of which we'll get into in detail here, were voted unanimously, nearly unanimously out of this task force, and that is what we're basing the bill on. And Corey, if you want to talk about exactly how the land claims came to be with the court cases.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Corey Hinton. Ambassador, thank you so much for the introduction and getting us to this point. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you all today and for the support of the Environmental Coalition. At the first bullet that you see on this slide, Joint Tribal Council of the Passamaquoddy Tribe v. Morton, that is a lawsuit that the Passamaquoddy tribe brought against the United States in 1975 to essentially force federal recognition. Up until the 1970s, the tribes in Maine had been presumed to be under the exclusive jurisdiction of the state, bar none. But there was a sentiment among the tribal communities that was not correct, and in fact, perhaps illegal, given how the relationship between tribes and the United States and states exists elsewhere. So the Passamaquoddy tribe brought the lawsuit, sued the United States, and that resulted in a landmark decision which recognized the Passamaquoddy tribe and the Penobscot Nation as federally recognized tribes like any other. And it essentially recognized that the state of Maine's perspective that the tribes were under the thumb of the state and that they had no jurisdiction that didn't flow from the state. This opinion proved that wrong. Following 1975's Morton decision, there were 3 other court cases that led to the Settlement Act. 2 of those court cases involved attempts by the tribes in Maine to utilize and exercise sovereign powers that other tribes have elsewhere. One of those cases related to whether or not the Passamaquoddy tribe had criminal jurisdiction over activities on its reservation. And and the other dealt with whether or not the tribe had sovereign immunity from lawsuit, a critical aspect of tribal sovereignty. And in both of those cases, one which went through the First Circuit and in one that went to the Maine law court, the courts ruled in favor of tribal sovereignty and essentially said, just because the state of Maine didn't recognize these tribes does not mean that these are not tribes like any other tribe in the United States. And the takeaway from those cases was very clearly that the tribes in Maine have the rights, privileges, benefits, and immunities of every other federally recognized tribe in the United States. Those cases were between maybe like 1978, 1979, and they prompted the Settlement Act negotiations, which really only came about because the United States sued the state of Maine. The United States sued the state of Maine. The tribes did not sue the state of Maine for illegal dispossession of the tribes of their land. And so when US v. Maine was brought by the United States, and after those court decisions said that the tribes have jurisdictional powers like other tribes, the state of Maine came to the table and negotiated very, very hard. And those negotiations resulted in a two-part settlement. The first is the Maine Implementing Act, which sets the jurisdictional boundaries between the tribes. And instead of following the rules of Indian law, which generally have a tribal federal model, the Implementing Act implements a tribal state model. And then the federal component essentially authorized the state component. It created the Land Claim Settlement Fund and essentially constituted the federal government's relinquishment of some of its obligations with respect to tribal lands in Maine. There have been several attempts since 1980 to re-examine parts of the Settlement Act prior to the task force of 2019. And these efforts were all born out of recognition that the settlement has had a disproportionately negative impact on the tribes. The tribes have not been able to acquire the lands that they were authorized to acquire, and the jurisdictional components of the Settlement Act have proven to essentially strangle economic development and tribal self-determination at just about every turn. As a result, as the ambassador said, the tribes in Maine are not exercising the benefits and immunities that other tribes exercise elsewhere. And even some of the activities that the tribes were engaged in at the time of the Settlement Act turned out to be deemed not lawful under the Settlement Act. It's just something that the tribes never really bargained for. And that's that last bullet there. The Penobscot Nation was engaged in gaming. They didn't believe that they were negotiating away their right to conduct economic development. It turns out the state of Maine had that exact thing in mind. And so that business of the Penobscot Nation was shut down because of the Settlement Act. The recommendations for the task force, which met from 2019 until, from July or so of 2019 until December of 2019, touched on large categories that cover pretty much all aspects of tribal jurisdiction. You see them listed here, but it's trust land acquisition, use of land and natural resources, hunting and fishing, taxing, criminal jurisdiction, civil jurisdiction, gaming, and the applicability of federal laws to the tribes in Maine. The recommendations, as the ambassador said, were nearly unanimous. They were all unanimous with the exception, I think, of just one or two criminal jurisdiction recommendations that were, I think there was just one dissenting vote. And the recommendations were then placed into legislation that was LD 2094 in the last legislature. But even if passed by the legislature, all of these revisions would require the tribes to adopt the changes to the Settlement Act through their own lawmaking processes, which is exactly what was required during the original Settlement Act process. At the end of the day, the goal is for the tribes to be able to, in all of these subjects that you see, exercise the powers and benefits that other tribes have. As we talk about some of these issues, we like to talk through what tribal lands means, and this comes up a lot. There are generally three categories of lands that are owned by tribes in the United States. The first category is reservation lands. Maulian mentioned Indian Islands and Zibayaga Madakmiguk. Those are examples of reservations that have been held since time immemorial. In other words, the tribes have always held those communities, and those lands were reserved and they are protected for that reason. The second large category is trust lands. The process for lands to become trust lands, and sorry, let me take a step back. Trust lands means that lands are owned by the United States and held in a protected trust status for the benefit of a tribal nation. That process to put the lands in trust is only complete after the Department of the Interior receives an application and goes through an internal administrative process that is, well, it's part internal and then it's part external because there's requirements for consultation with local governments and state governments. And trust lands are how most of the tribe's territory in Maine is held. Trust lands are what the tribes were allowed to acquire as a part of the actual land claim settlement. So that each tribe, Passamaquoddy and Penobscot, was allowed to acquire up to 150,000 acres of trust lands. And neither tribe has acquired that amount. Fee lands is a reference to lands that, you know, that anyone would hold. You'd hold a fee title to your house if you own your house. And tribes in the same way will own lands that are not in this restricted reservation status or in a restricted trust status. And the tribes in Maine have, in some situations, fairly high levels of fee land ownership. And many of those lands have not been able to go into trust status because the Settlement Act creates a very challenging process for those lands to go into trust that often requires the payment of fees and state and local consent. And that process to convert fee lands to trust lands for the tribes in Maine is much, much different and much more expensive and complicated than it is for tribes elsewhere in the United States. To take a step back and think about where the tribes are in Maine, we like to use this graphic here. Important to note that this is a Penobscot map. So where it says trust lands in red, these are Penobscot Nation trust lands. In green, this is Penobscot fee lands in Carrabasset Valley. And then you're not going to see a lot of fee lands for Maliseet and Micmac because they don't have very many. But you'll see that Penobscot and Passamaquoddy have been able to acquire some trust lands, but they are quite sporadic and by no means have the tribe sort of bought up all of the state of Maine. In the arena of trust land acquisitions, the task force recommendations were effectively to enable the tribes to acquire all of the lands that were guaranteed to them under the Settlement Act. This is it was a fundamental premise of the Settlement Act, and it's one that's totally unfulfilled, which, you know, I think sort of underscores the fact that the Settlement Act, as conceived and executed and implemented, is a failed model. The fact that the state government and local governments can veto the tribe's ability to put land in the trust has been a major problem for the tribes. And so the task force recommendations would eliminate local veto for tribes for lands that the Passamaquoddy tribe already holds in fee status. With respect to Penobscot is and for all other lands, the parties would be agreeing to a process that doesn't require local consent, but that does require that there be significant government-to-government cooperation prior to any lands being put forward to the United States for trust acquisition. Essentially, this is intended to facilitate that fundamental principle of the Settlement Act, putting those 150,000 acres of land in trust. And beyond that, the tribes seek access to the same federal laws that other tribes use to put lands in trust. And there's an 90-year-old law now called the Indian Reorganization Act that's been applied by Department of the Interior to put lands in trust. And the tribes effectively seek access to that process. Now, as this bottom bullet says, the tribes can only engage in that process if there are effectively laws passed by the tribe to authorize efforts to put lands in trust. And as I mentioned before, the federal process does require consideration in most areas of local considerations and tax implications and jurisdictional conflicts. In the arena of land use and natural resources, the task force recommendation was quite broad and simple. It was to restore and affirm the tribe's right to regulate natural resources and land use within their territories. This means that the tribes would be able to regulate commercial, residential, and really any type of land use on tribal lands through zoning codes, dealing with local communities, or it could be, more broadly natural resource regulations that would apply to tribal members and non-tribal members. It's important to note that the tribes do currently have some authority to regulate on-reservation activities. So, for example, I know the Penobscot Nation has adopted significant parts of the Maine revised statutes with respect to certain natural resource regulation issues. But there are areas where the tribes definitely have limited authority, and there's been a slew of litigation going back to the early 2000s around the ability of the tribes to effectively act as a state with respect to administering their on-reservation status. There are processes in place for tribes and states to apply to the EPA, for example, to regulate their environments. And tribes elsewhere in the United States use this all of the time, every single day. And the state of Maine has generally fought the ability of the Maine tribes to exercise that authority, because the state of Maine has argued that the tribal exercise of environmental regulatory authority would conflict with the Settlement Act. And so essentially the tribes are hoping to have confirmed ability and slightly expanded authority, more clear authority to exercise environmental rights and benefits that are available to other tribes elsewhere in the United States. With respect to Fish and Game, the task force recommendations were to recognize tribal laws that currently regulate hunting and fishing on tribal lands. It's important to note that the Settlement Act currently permits the tribes to regulate hunting and fishing activities on tribal lands, but it limits the ability of the tribes to actually enforce those laws with respect to non-tribal citizens. So this task force summary would essentially confirm the tribe's ability to have those laws and would bolster their ability to enforce those laws and regulations. As a part of this category, the task force recommendations also recognize that the tribes in some situations may have reserved rights that guarantee the ability to, say, fish off reservation lands. And the task force recommendation in this arena was to recognize the state's ability to regulate tribal activities off tribal lands to the extent consistent with tribal treaty or tribal reserved rights. This essentially means that non-tribal members will be required to submit the tribal law on tribal lands when hunting and fishing. And it means that tribal members would be able to engage in their treaty guaranteed fishing rights off reservation, provided that such uses are consistent with environmental laws and are consistent with the treaty rights. And in any of these situations where activities on or off reservation posed a threat to the environment, federal law provides for states to step in and to work with tribes to address those threats to the environment. Taxation authority is one way that tribal nations, really all governments in the United States, generate revenue, right? The tribes in Maine do not have the authority to be taxing entities. And so the task force recommendations in this realm would recognize the tribe's authority to tax tribal members and tribal entities on tribal lands. And it would also recognize that tribal members' activities on tribal lands are exempt from state and local taxation. This means essentially adopting the rules of federal Indian law that apply to tax elsewhere in the United States. This means that tribal member income earned on tribal lands would not be subject to state income tax. It means that if I was to start a basket making operation on the reservation using materials that I harvested on the reservation, those sales from my shop would not be subject to state sales tax. It would mean, though, that the tribes could tax those activities if they would like. And this is what we mean in terms of the creation of governmental revenue. The recommendations in this realm are essentially to enable the tribes to become a taxing authority if they would like, to generate revenue from taxing on tribal lands. But in many situations, how this plays out in Indian country is that although tribal activities will be exempt from state taxation, non-tribal activities may still be subject to state taxation. And so what happens, and the rules are a bit convoluted and they're generated from Supreme Court cases over the years. So what we see happen is that tribes and states in places like Arizona, Washington, Oklahoma, really everywhere, they enter into tax agreements where there are agreements to collect taxes and to remit taxes back to the tribal government. This guarantees a flow of revenue to both state and tribal governments. But all of this would be contingent on really the tribes passing laws to regulate these activities. With respect to criminal jurisdiction, the task force recommendations are to authorize the tribes to write criminal laws and to enforce criminal laws with respect to Indians and with respect to non-Indians who commit crimes that are subject to jurisdiction under the Violence Against Women Act. And all that means with respect to non-Indians is that jurisdiction would exist when there are certain categories of domestic crimes that are committed. Generally, the tribes within this framework would be seeking jurisdiction to exercise over classes A, B, and C crimes, with the state government retaining overarching jurisdiction over major crimes, which is very similar to how things are handled elsewhere in Indian country, except that the federal government typically exercises jurisdiction over high-level crimes. This means, though, that tribes would be able to commit greater resources and would be able to obtain greater levels of resources to expand tribal courts, which would be exercising greater levels of jurisdiction. Like with all of these categories, the tribes, in order to exercise this jurisdiction, would need to pass laws, which they always do, and then to administer those laws. So it's not as though, you know, on day one, you have a situation where the tribes have very limited criminal jurisdiction over misdemeanors only, and tomorrow, all of a sudden, they have much greater jurisdiction. There would need to be a lawmaking process that occurs in between. For civil jurisdiction, the task force recommendations were to restore tribal civil jurisdiction over Indians and non-Indians on tribal lands. This essentially means that the tribes would have the ability to write laws that deal in areas of civil jurisdiction, and also to adjudicate matters that arise from implementation of those laws. And here we're talking about laws that protect the health, safety, and welfare of the communities. Generally speaking, under federal Indian law, tribes have civil jurisdiction over Indians and non-Indians that are on tribal lands. And those are the rules that we're seeking to have applicable here in Maine. But again, this means that the tribes would need to pass laws to exercise that authority. And it's really important to note that right now, with respect to civil jurisdiction, the Settlement Act very, very narrowly defines the jurisdiction that Passamaquoddy and Penobscot have. And the Settlement Act really doesn't provide any guidance with respect to the Halton Band of Maliseet's ability to have a court and to exercise civil jurisdiction. So the tribes are seeking to, across the board, enhance their jurisdiction in areas where there's very great disparity right now in the state of Maine. And in the state of Maine with respect to also other tribes in other states. Finally, with respect to federal laws, the task force recommendation was to amend the Maine Implementing Act to allow federal laws that apply elsewhere in Indian country to apply to tribes in Maine. It's important to note, and the ambassador touched upon this earlier, there is a provision of the Federal Settlement Act that prevents laws passed by Congress for the benefit of Indians from applying in Maine unless those laws are specifically applicable to Maine. This has blocked everything from the Violence Against Women Act to laws that enhance the ability of tribes to react to emergencies, to the Tribal Law and Order Act. These are examples of the laws. And another one here is the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. Now, in theory, all of these laws have been blocked by the Federal Settlement Act, but the Federal Settlement Act also gives the state and the tribes the authority to reallocate jurisdiction between them. So here, the tribes are seeking access to federal laws that Congress has passed for the benefit of tribes elsewhere. And that does not mean that the tribes would be operating freely. I mean, these are federal laws, and like with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, for example, there are very precise and well-defined regulatory frameworks that exist for administering those laws. And so the tribes would be operating under federal law. It's not like they would be totally immune from law altogether. And then gaming, the task force recommendation was to permit the tribes to decide whether or not they would like to exercise authority under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. This means that the tribes would be able to conduct gaming in accordance with federal law and would be required to allocate any revenues from their gaming to tribal members and to their governments themselves. This does not mean that the tribes could go out and open casinos on every piece of land that they own. It would require that first and foremost, the tribes pass a law that authorizes gaming. So there must be a policy decision made. That law would then need to be approved by the United States. And if approved by the United States, the tribes would be able to conduct gaming. And there's different levels of gaming, but the big sort of casino that you see in Bangor, for example, Hollywood Slots, that sort of casino could only exist if there is an agreement reached by the tribe and the state. And that's a function of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And so here, the tribes are not seeking to necessarily open that big casino or not, but we all feel that it's a very important exercise of self-determination for the tribes to have the right to be able to decide whether or not they would like to engage in tribal gaming. Maulian, would you like to talk about where we go from here before we turn it over to any other questions?
Yes, please go get a drink of water. We presented this a few times. I'm always really in awe of how Corey's able to get a lot of information out in a really efficient way. So as you can see, it's quite a bit in a bill, but really, if you boil it down, it's about bringing tribes into, parity and fairness with every other tribe in the country. And it's really not a scary thing. It's something that's already happening basically everywhere else, and the sky hasn't fallen yet. So one logistical point I'll make is that we've taken gaming out of the omnibus bill and we're running it as a standalone bill. And that is going to be, that's already printed and scheduled. And that's sponsored by Representative Ben Collings of Portland. That is LD 554. And that will go before the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee, I believe on March 17th. So, and I think Corey did a wonderful job talking about gaming. And I'll talk a little bit about our strategy for making that a separate bill. It really is its own thing when it comes to Maine and the tribes. And when we look at history, we don't see Maine as against expanding gaming. We see Maine as against tribes expanding into gaming. There have been referendum questions time and time again where the tribes are denied, other entities are allowed. So, I remember back in 2003, we were on the ballot to have a casino. Bangor was on the ballot to have a casino. And I think that they were question number 2 and we were question number 3. And they beat us, I think, 2-1. So things like that send a very resounding message to tribes that this really isn't about a moral or ethical dilemma about having more gaming in Maine. It's really about telling the tribes that you can't do it. And that you should be kind of, under the thumb of the state when it comes to making decisions about your own economies and how you want to build those economies. So I think it's important that gambling and all of this isn't kind of woven into tribal philosophies and communities, but like Corey said, it should be our right to decide if we would like to take advantage of those opportunities with our status as federally recognized tribal nations. So that bill is going to be separate. Getting back to the omnibus bill, that is kind of the rest of the recommendations. We were able to work the Violence Against Women Act jurisdiction as another bill last session. I think we got it in on March 17th. We finally got it through the process, so it was right in the nick of time. And that's a great example I like to give about why this is so important in the day-to-day life of our communities. So our tribal court at Penobscot Nation, we see, in our community, we see quite a bit of domestic violence cases. Our tribal court had not had the authority to try those cases. So a lot of these victims were getting lost in their jurisdictional maze. They were being re-traumatized, having to tell these stories over and over again, and a lot of difficulties in finding who was going to hear these cases. And, a lot of people, when it came down to it, didn't know what to do with them. So a lot of these cases get thrown out. We have a very low conviction rate, if any, and we're not getting justice for victims. So having that authorization under the Federal Violence Against Women Act being able to be put to work in our communities is a really big deal. And it was something that we accomplished in collaboration with the state. And I think it's also a great example of a precedent that we can set around tribal-state relations. When we see a problem in our communities, there are solutions to get there. And this was a tricky process, I think. There was a lot of questions about sentencing and the length of those sentences, what crimes can be in what court. But at the end of the day, we were able to articulate that people were suffering because we didn't have access to this law. And I think a lot of that education going forward about these other areas in the bill will be super important. I really like to talk about how this won't just benefit the tribal nations, it will benefit all of Maine. And I'm loving seeing a lot of intersections of the different work that I get to do. I get to chair a subcommittee on equity for the Maine Climate Council. I'm also a co-chair of the Permanent Commission on the Status of Indigenous, Racial, and Tribal Populations in Maine. And a big theme that I'm seeing in a lot of this work is that when you hold space for the most vulnerable communities, you lift the whole state. And I really think that if we can think of tribal sovereignty as justice, as fair, as inherent and something that we already have, and not something like we're asking the state for. We know that we're sovereign nations, and we know that we always have been. We've been living under the Settlement Act that has been used to undermine our rights, basically. So this is really not taking anything from anybody else. This is a way to wrap our arms around those rights and take them back. And I think for next steps, we can get into that a little bit. I think an immediate action item is you can go to wabanakialliance.com and sign up for our email list, and we can talk about that at the end as well. And I think it might be a great time to take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Dana. Thank you, Corey. There are a ton of questions. You have answered a lot of them already. It was very interesting to watch questions come into the chat and then hear the answers coming out of your mouth. So I can tell you have given this presentation, and we really appreciate you sharing it with us today. Definitely, everybody who's been on a Lunch and Learn before knows that we like to share a call to action, and can't think of a better one than to visit wabanakialliance.com. We will share that link in the follow-up email this afternoon, though thank you for making it pretty simple for us to remember. There's just a ton on that site: Wabanaki history, a legislative scorecard, the slides that Corey went through today will be up there as well. And please do sign up for updates there. There'll be a lot of information to track as the legislative session goes on. And this is the way to make sure you get information directly from Wabanaki Alliance. A couple of foundational questions before we get into the next round. To clarify, does the Federal Settlement Act apply to all other tribes everywhere except for Maine?
No, the Federal Settlement Act only applies to it only applies to the Penobscot Nation, the Passamaquoddy tribe, and the Hinton Band of Maliseet for our purposes here. Okay.
And will federal law need to be modified if we're successful with this effort and tribal sovereignty is recognized as it should be? Will the federal law need to be modified?
It's a great question. And I think there's two schools of thought on this. I mentioned during the presentation that there's a part of the federal law that says that the tribes and the state can reach agreements on certain issues of jurisdictional natures. And so in that realm, there's clear authority given for the state and the tribe to negotiate, the ability of the tribe to exercise jurisdiction over certain federal laws. And in theory, that may be sufficient. However, we have discussed going to Congress at some point to hopefully secure affirmation of what we are doing in Augusta. But it's unclear what that process will look like, and exactly, whether or not it's necessary is an even another question. But that's a slippery slope that we're hoping to have confirmed at some point through the federal Congress.
Thank you. And then in terms of this effort, how do we track it? How has this bill been printed, or how do we know what's going on?
Yeah, it's not quite out of the revisor's office yet. It will be sponsored by Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, who's also the Assistant Majority Leader now, which is great news. And so as soon as we have that LD number and we're able to track it, we can distribute that information. But it will be one large bill with just the gaming piece taken out.
Gotcha. And are there points that you would particularly like for folks to make when reaching out to their legislators in support? Is that information on the Wabanaki Alliance site?
Yeah, we're working on those materials right now with very specific talking points, but I think the broad picture is that this is about fairness and equity. And I think the most, the more that we can push that message, the better. This really isn't about special rights, it's about equal rights. And it's about, the tribes, our ancestors were here since time immemorial. It's not like we're ever going to be anywhere else. Like, we are here to stay. So the state might as well get used to, us having these rights, because we absolutely will not stop being sovereign nations.
And the other part of that is, the other big theme to keep in mind is that this is really about building stronger communities in Maine. I've picked up on this dynamic where folks are like, well, is it, it's the Indians against the non-Indians? And no, these are tribal communities seeking to be stronger for their own citizens, which employ non-tribal citizens, tribal governments, which provide direct government services to neighboring communities. I work with tribes elsewhere in the United States, and I can say very clearly that where tribal sovereignty is allowed to be exercised to the fullest extent, the strongest governments in those regions are tribal governments. And so this is very much about the tribe seeking to be the sort of the tide that lifts all boats, if you will. In parts of rural Maine where the economies crashed decades ago and where there's very clearly nothing on the horizon, the tribes can be a part of the solution to restoring these rural economies in Maine.
With all of that, we didn't need really a justification beyond fairness and equity, right? But there are so many powerful cases. A lot of folks on the call today are wondering, where could opposition possibly be coming from?
I think a lot of it is the fear of the unknown. I think that a lot of times, if you really want to get into it, I think there's layers of the histories of colonization, and I think there can be a defensiveness sometimes where it's like, oh no, the Indians are going to come for what's owed to them, and this is about revenge or there's a fear, and that fear is from this long-held maybe shame, or the truth about history is so often in our society not told, and that ambiguity leads to anxiety and nervousness and this us against them thing that Corey talked about. So I think that when it really boils down to it, a lot of the opposition can be dispelled pretty easily by clearly communicating the things that we have today. From what I hear, it's like, well, if they get this through, they'll just put casinos up on every corner. They'll kick people off their lands trying to hunt. It's this great fear of the unknown. So thinking about that map in the presentation where you can see where the tribal lands are, the changes we're talking about will only be happening on those very small pieces of land. And the bright green for Penobscot is fee land. And a lot of these changes wouldn't even necessarily apply to those. So we're talking about an even smaller batch of land. And I think, Maine is so used to the Land Claims Settlement Act being its basis for Indian law and all that it's ever known. So having that be the law of the land for the past 40 years, and really the state has used that Settlement Act to its advantage in a lot of our litigation, that can be scary to let go of. And I think also, I admittedly was not born in 1980, but I believe at that time, by a lot of people, it was seen as a really great achievement that this settlement was able to be reached. And it was signed by President Carter. He had a big eagle feather on his pen, and it was kind of a big moment. And the tribes were able to get resources and to purchase this trust land. So what I think about now that nobody knew back then is that it would be such a struggle to amend this thing. I think back then when it was happening, there was this understanding, like any document, it will be a living document. And if there's things that need to be changed, we'll change it and we'll collaborate and we'll look to best solutions. And that hasn't happened. It's been set in stone. We've been told, too bad, you signed it, deal with it. And, I think we have segments of the population that really want to rest in a place that could be seen as bigoted or racist, and they have attitudes and stereotypical things in their mind. And I also think we have people that are just very afraid of the unknown. So with everything we're doing, I truly hope in my heart of hearts we can reach all of those people.
And the only thing I'd add to that wonderful answer from the ambassador is just to put a bit of a finer point on it. We want to talk about where opposition will come from. Special interest groups. So I sat in the room for every single minute of every hearing and session that we had in Augusta in 2020. And our primary opposition is coming from, I think, two places. First and foremost, there are groups that have made institutions off of exploitation of natural resources. They've created untold amounts of intergenerational wealth. The largest landowners in Maine tend to be pulp and paper companies. And those are the entities that have stood up perhaps most strongly. The Forest Products Council in particular, they took great issue with the tribe's efforts in this arena. The fear being that the tribes will over-regulate and overly protect the environment. We also heard in a similar vein from the Maine Sportsmen's Alliance, which said that the tribes will take actions that are irresponsible with respect to fish and game. And, in both of these arenas, hearing from sportsmen's guides and from pulp and paper companies that the tribes that have relied on the resources and the fish and the game to survive, that we will somehow be the ones that, take down the environment at the end of the day. That's a tough pill to swallow. But those are some of the very specific special interest groups that we've heard from. We also heard from casino lobbyists. The casinos do not want competition. And so those are the three primary special interest groups that we are dealing with. And so, yeah, I just add that to the ambassador's answer.
Thank you. I really appreciate both of those answers, the sort of underlying social frayed social fabric, and then the specifics as well. To the first point, Ambassador, that you mentioned, we have a question from a teacher who's wondering what kinds of resources there might be to help change that. You noted, and we've talked on some of these previous programs about how much of our history is not told and not understood. How can we change that? How can we do better going forward?
Education continues to be a huge part of all of this. And 20 years ago, my great aunt, Donna Loring, who has a pretty colorful career in state and tribal politics, she was serving as a Penobscot Nation tribal representative and was able to get a bill through that requires Wabanaki studies being in the curriculum of Maine schools. Now, the bill didn't have a fiscal note, so it hasn't been mandated or enforced very well over these 20 years. But I think, having it be 20 years later, it's a great time to reflect. The babies that were born the year that law was passed could vote in the last election that we had. So thinking about the opportunities or missed opportunities in the lives of those children is something that's been heavy on my mind. I am glad to say that the Department of Education and the governor have reconvened a task force around that law and looking at where it's going well, where we need more support and resources. And I understand, my mother has been a teacher for a few decades now, and teachers are spread very thin. It's hard to add things into their curriculum. They're often buying their own school supplies, and we don't support educators as much as we should, absolutely. So I think that the key is to really get this into institutions and have it be as important as other subjects are seen. And really, it doesn't have to be a separate thing. You can weave in this important history and culture and modern day presence of the Wabanaki into so many study areas. So I'm glad that that's going on. Portland Public Schools has been doing a fabulous job in partnership with the Abbey Museum, getting Wabanaki studies into their curriculums. And the Abbey Museum just continues to be such an important resource, I think, for all of the, it covers all of the tribes of Maine in a lot of the resources they have. Each tribe has an education and cultural department. So in a lot of our websites, you can find different resources. My tribe is penobscotnation.org, and our culture department has a beautifully made website with a lot of important history and cultural things. And a big part of this is to remain aware of the modern events like we're talking about today, because I think a lot of what happens is, a lot of people only learn about Indigenous people as stereotypes, as mascots, as the Land O'Lakes lady, as things like that. So as we're busting through a lot of those things, we're making room to understand about the whole picture of Indigenous people. And that a huge part of that is that we're not kind of relegated to being like a mythical died out people of the past. We are very much still here. And I think once broader society gets more comfortable with that, that will go a long way.
Thank you. If maybe I'm going to stop saying if, when the tribal sovereignty effort is in Maine is successful, what do you think the impact will be on the effort to protect 30% of Maine's land and waters by 2030? Are there efforts? I know, Ambassador Dana, you played an important role on the Climate Council, and protecting 30% of Maine's land was one of those goals in the Climate Action Plan. How do you see that intersecting with this work?
I think it can only help it. And I think, part of my work on the Climate Council, I kind of always kept in mind, should we meet, or when we meet, I like that, Kathleen, this big goal of amending the Settlement Act. Like Corey talked about, it's almost insulting for us to hear that anything tribal people would do would harm the environment or have any adverse effects. We have, our natural resources departments in our communities are really standard setting groups of people. John Banks, our director of natural resources, is on the call now, and he's been messaging me things. He's just a really great supporter. But the work that his department does, studying water, air, even throughout the pandemic, they've been out on our lands, making sure that our standards are being met and kept, and that the fish are healthy. And such a huge part of Maine's environmental future is the tribes having jurisdiction, and the tribes being able to have, our inherent sovereignty recognized, because the environment and all these things, they aren't separate things for us. It's woven into who we are, as being stewards of Mother Earth. So our goals will only help the larger goals of the Climate Council and the state when it comes to the environment. And should a new administration come along down the line in Maine that does not have great climate goals, that does not set up, this good foundation, the tribes will still be here doing what we've been doing for generations to protect the environment.
It's a really good reminder. One of the things we talk a lot about at MCV is how we make sure that we're making durable progress on our climate goals. And you've been doing that for a lot longer than we have. So thank you. John Banks, you're promoted to speaker. If you have anything you want to add, we're making a habit of this. Didn't this happen last week? I like it. It's a good trend.
Well, I guess, the fish wouldn't have got caught if he didn't open up his mouth. So thank you for calling on me. I'm not going to add a lot other than to say thank you for all the great work that you guys are doing in support of tribal sovereignty. It's just wicked important. And I really want to thank Maulian and Corey for the great job that they're doing with these presentations. They are spot on. And it really gives me a lot of hope for the future of our relationship. So thank you.
You're the man, John. Thank you.
And it does feel good to have a growing base of support. I'm curious about whether you feel like there are allies at the federal level now. And particularly, I know a lot of us are just so thrilled about the strong committee vote that Deb Haaland got to be the first Indigenous leader of the Department of the Interior. Think she'll come weigh in on this? Fingers crossed.
The door is open and the hand is outreached. Yeah, absolutely. We would, love to have her at any point. She's been just a tremendous leader and steward of all the same things that we're talking about here, for sure. I also would love to acknowledge that Representative Shelley Pingree in her new leadership position on her Interior Appropriations Committee is really great news for the tribes in Maine. She's been a great ally for us all along. And I think, a big part of our charge now is working with our federal delegation under the Biden administration. There's certainly been a cloud lifted, I'll say, when it comes to a lot of things at the federal government. So we're definitely working very hard on that as well.
That's great news. We can send a link to this program to Deb Haaland and anybody else we want, right? Thinking even more broadly from Maine to the nation to the world, do you know if we have recognized in Maine the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and how the work happening here in Maine lines up with anything happening internationally?
Funny. It's a great question. And it's funny. It's not funny, but it is sort of ironic because Maine did pass a joint resolution to support the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. And I have it in my files because it's really important for me to have. But at the same time, the UN Rapporteur for Indigenous Rights wrote a specific report calling out Maine for utterly failing to live up to its obligations with respect to Indigenous human rights. So Maine made that commitment from a legislative perspective on paper, and unfortunately, it has not been lived up to at this point.
Oof, yes, I agree. Funny, but not funny, actually. Thank you. There are so many questions that we are not going to have a chance to get to today, so I want to make sure to point people to the Wabanaki Alliance website. Some of the questions that I've seen come in are really specific about language in letters to the editor, or folks wanting to make sure that your donations of funds, but also how do you go about donating land? What's the best way for people to reach out and make sure they're offering the kind of help that's helpful in the way that you most need?
Yeah, I think using the Wabanaki Alliance website is a good start, and I believe our contact information, for the Alliance is on there. And as this session gets going, we'll be doing a lot of outreach and action items around the legislation. But I think it'll, of course, be broader than that. So we'll be able to have those discussions around, those requests and stuff like that too. And it's definitely a great problem to have when a lot of people want to help you and they don't know how. So we're in deep gratitude for that.
And we are in deep gratitude for the opportunity to help facilitate that. So if folks want to filter any questions to MCV, we can help that as well. Just so grateful for both of you being on today, Ambassador Dana, Corey Hinton. I just am so grateful for your ongoing advocacy and your generosity of time and spirit with us today. Thanks to all of you for joining. This, I believe, is perhaps a record-setting program for us. So that's a very good sign. Next week, we will be back in this space with Maine's Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows. 2020 was a banner year for democracy access and voting access across the United States, and Maine was no exception. So Secretary Bellows will join us to talk about her priorities, state of voting rights in Maine, what improvements we can expect to see. And, it's all about voting rights and equity and fairness and all of those good things. Thank you. I hope you'll join us next week and have a fabulous weekend.